this session on safeguarding, which is the second in our series of 3 events hosted in partnership with the Department for Education. We're really pleased to welcome our speaker today, Jayne Lowe. She's one of NSM's external consultants and also is an advisor to the DFE. Jayne has worked in a range of settings, including special and alternative provision schools. So any of you who are leading special or AP schools this week, just as relevant for yourselves. And also we'll be talking a little bit today about the COVID context as well. So hopefully we'll be able to give you some really practical and useful tips and points of reflection for your schools. Just in terms of a bit of housekeeping before I hand over to Jayne, please do keep yourselves on mute, as I'm sure you all very much used to, but please do put any questions that you have for Jayne in the chat as we go through, and we will come to those. You can also message me directly using the chat function as well if you want to ask anything anonymously. We are recording today's session, as you'll see as well, so just to be mindful of that, and we do have colleagues from the department on the call today as well. I think that's everything that I needed to cover. So Jayne, without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Hannah, that's great. Welcome to everybody. I know it's a really challenging time at the moment. I'm hoping to be able to stop saying that fairly soon, but I know at the moment in terms of cover and staffing and things are tough, so thanks for giving the time, much appreciated. NSN asked me to put together an hour session around safeguarding, focused on safeguarding culture. So that's what I've attempted to do. We're going to run until around 3 o'clock. I promise to try and finish on time. As Hannah said, any questions, when it comes to safeguarding, there are no stupid questions and there are no questions too small. So please don't be afraid to ask something if you've got something grumbling or on your mind. In terms of culture of safeguarding, this has been talked about for some time. Ofsted have been talking about a culture of safeguarding and try to define what that actually means. And that's what I'm hoping to do as part of this session. It means a number of things, and it's about always acting in the best interests of children, to protect them in school, outside of school, online and offline. That's been a big focus, particularly during COVID. To identify pupils who need help and those who might be at risk of harm and those that we know already have been harmed. It's about securing the help that children and their families need if they require it, but also to do that in a timely way and tap into the right amount of expertise and the right type of expertise to support very, very specific problems. It's about managing safer recruitment, allegations about staff. It's about keeping a safe environment. In fact, the more we talk about it, the development of culture, it's huge. It's certainly not a tick box or compliance exercise. It's about a way of thinking and a way of doing things. And that's not just for the DSL or the head teacher of a school to do. It's about instilling that culture of vigilance across your team, across your leadership team, but also your wider staff team, and constantly thinking and having in your mind any of those really negative impacts that come from safeguarding could happen in our building, it could happen here. So having that thought, it's not a bad thought to have. In terms of the focus areas I want to touch on today, this is what I want to try and take us through, if that's okay. So we've got a number of aims to work on during the session. And I want to, obviously, no surprises, understand the importance of safeguarding, but also consider its scope. I've mentioned something there about scope, and it is huge. And it's thinking about a different way of looking at culture and thinking about the parameters of safeguarding. Considering the elements that make up a really strong safeguarding culture, I think that's really important and something that we can work on continuously. Also think about the components that make up a safeguarding curriculum, and that's a curriculum for staff and for children, so that staff can keep children safe, but also we can enable children, no matter their age, to keep themselves safe and be enabled by what we teach them and how we teach that. And also then, don't really want to end on COVID, but I do want to talk about COVID to some extent, about how we manage to safeguard children within a context that's very, very different for us all, although it's been going on for some time now. And that continuously changes and brings new challenges all of the time. I want to spend some time thinking about that. And it's not all bad. There's some learning to take from COVID, for sure. Okay, this is quite a different focus. Often the go-to document in schools is keeping children safe in education. No surprises, that sets out the parameters of what's expected of schools. But another really useful document that I urge people to go to more readily than maybe they do currently is Working Together to Safeguard Children. It maps out the responsibilities of all of the different agencies that collaborate around children, and it takes a very holistic view of safeguarding. So it's really helpful reference guide when thinking about what is safeguarding culture, and a really useful document that also sets out the expectations of collaborative working. So it's a useful piece of reference material, sometimes with the most complex cases too. As I said, the document takes a holistic view of safeguarding, pointing out some of the key elements, the health of children, the development of children, care and safety, but also the outcomes. A real focus on education within that document, so our bread and butter, if you like. The one thing that the document does manage to convey is it's a huge job, and it doesn't simply focus on prevention and what to do in the most tragic of circumstances or with very, very complex cases. It very clearly outlines, sorry, I'm not sure why that slide skipped then, but it did. It clearly outlines the notion of creating optimum conditions for children, which allow children to thrive, which aligns with this notion of creating a safeguarding culture where children are safe, but they're supported to get the very best outcomes and take ownership of their own safety too. As I said before, KCSE, or Keeping Children Safe in Education, is often our go-to document, but this one does offer something more in terms of how agencies should work together. So it's a definite go-to guide if it isn't something that you're already referencing in your work, in your policy and procedures, and also when you are working through some complex cases too. Okay, I want to talk now about what we need to safeguard against. And by doing this, what I'm hoping to do is try and map out the scope of safeguarding. Having worked with preschools for a number of years now, a lot of years actually, kind of started my support with them in wave 2, so a long, long time ago. The one thing I'm very mindful of as new schools, free schools, we've got this golden opportunity of creating a school from the ground up, which is a golden opportunity that we must embrace and make the very most of. However, we start as new schools from ground zero with no procedures around safeguarding, child protection in its most complex sense, but also safeguarding in its widest sense. And that creates a significant challenge for new schools that we should never underestimate. In terms of safeguarding culture, this diagram that I'm going to talk through aims to kind of map out the holistic breadth of safeguarding culture and what we need to have in our minds when creating procedures within a school. I hope it gives some idea of the different elements, but also the extremities of procedures, incidents that could take place in and around school, and the procedures that we need to have in place to underpin fundamental things that are part of curriculum and school life, such as trips and visits, administering medication to children, and record keeping around safeguarding that we need to keep on a daily basis. So all of those things contribute to safeguarding, but in a new school, as I said before, they just don't exist. The diagram shows some names that I'm sure you will be familiar with, some of them from some time ago, but some of them very, very recent. And the children around the edge of this diagram have all lost their lives. They should all have attended school and been at school. Many of them were attending regularly. Those children in the middle had a near miss, and since that time, one of those children has also died as a result of a particular challenge that schools are trying to work on and address. The three girls in the middle, I'm sure that you will recognise their names. The three girls from Bethnal Green Academy who left to join IS some time ago now. And in terms of What the school did do and aimed to work with other agencies to do was to identify and protect children at risk of radicalisation. And that's ongoing work that schools are doing now through curriculum and through working with external agencies, including social care, but also the channel teams that sit within local authorities to make referrals to around children at that kind of risk. The two girls up at the top of the diagram you will associate with Ian Huntley, who was a caretaker in Soham, convicted in 2003, and he's going to serve a minimum of 40 years, well into his sentence now. This man had a history and should never have been appointed at that school. If due diligence and secure, safer recruitment and vetting were in place. So one of our key responsibilities, and this is a hefty one for brand new schools, is to operate safer recruitment procedures, but also deter those people who might abuse children from coming to work at our school. And when you've got to build a whole new staff team, that requires a lot in terms of rigour, procedures, but the sheer volume of working through and recruiting a whole new staff team. It creates challenges. Daniel Palker in 2013 lost his life, and he was beaten, force-fed salt, starved, held underwater and locked in a room without a door handle of primary age. And the school, again, had identified issues, reported concerns, and were attempting to work with other agencies around him, as were many other agencies. But the complications of sharing information and escalating procedures when it was needed to, that serious case review taught us a lot about not only reporting and recording, but working together with other agencies in order to keep children safe, and also take issue when we weren't comfortable with the action or lack of action that other agencies were taking. Our next name on the list is a really recent one, serious case review not yet conducted for Arthur Labinio Hughes. So in the news very, very recently of primary age. And we don't know quite what's going to fall out of that yet. However, if we look at the serious case reviews that have been conducted recently, around about 80% plus of serious case reviews come out with this finding, which is around sharing information between partner agencies. We know it's a challenge. And as a brand new school, it creates and presents a challenge for you. Often new schools are new to that community, maybe the trust is new to the community, but building relationships with partner agencies and partner schools is tough. And it's another thing to have to do. So investing in those relationships early is critical to make sure you know the right people in the right places, and you can attend forums and meetings where you need to be to work collaboratively with others to share information where it's useful and appropriate to do so. Okay, these two young men at the bottom, one of primary age and one of secondary age, unfortunately lost their lives through fatal injuries. One at a special school in Birmingham, where his wheelchair was left unattended on a landing and he actually fell down the stairs and lost his life. And the 9-year-old Mohammed lost his life following an allergic reaction and an inability then to find his EpiPen to address that as that happened. I'm going to talk about medical arrangements in a short while, but having those access arrangements in place and making those reasonable adjustments to keep children safe, again, it's something on our list to do's in terms of procedures. New schools operating in temporary accommodation and maybe then another new building, it's remembering to do it for the temps, update it when we move to the new site, and making sure that access arrangements are clear for everybody, line managed and overseen by people, and quality assured to make sure that they work. Okay, Jessica, age 12, so secondary school age, lost her life after sustaining a head injury at a swimming pool on a trip to France. I mentioned trips and visits earlier on, but making sure that arrangements are in place to risk assess for those situations, staff it appropriately, again, quality assure and check risk assessments to make sure that they are in place is a really important part of your work in preparing staff and training staff sufficiently to make sure that those arrangements are in place. And finally, Riley hung himself aged 12 at home. He'd been questioning his own sexuality for months before. Mum had reported issues to professionals around his inability to sleep and his anxious episodes that he was experiencing where he threatened to kill himself. And police had also found videos that he'd made himself about his own suicide. Interestingly, with this one, Mum opted out for Riley to do elective home education. And that's become a significant challenge in schools up and down the country of recently. In this case, it was a significant factor. During COVID, the number of families who chose to educate at home, because some of them were doing it anyway and found it difficult to return their children to school, the numbers increased dramatically, which schools are having to deal with and manage that, but also to add some rigour around, is that the right thing for families to do? So working with your local authority around EHE and alerting them to those families is an important part of your work, but also making sure that families know the support they can access in school. Okay, I want us to think now about, let me move this back, it keeps moving on really quickly, I'm sorry. Let me go back. Apologies for that. Okay, apologies, it moves so quickly. By showing you some of that, it doesn't cover all of the elements that policies and procedures need to be in place for, or all of the eventualities that you might come across. But what it does help us think about is the enormity of the role around safeguarding and those health and safety procedures and other elements that just play into this. So building capacity in the team to spot issues, record them, have procedures in place, follow them, gather information when something goes wrong, be bold and brave enough to report that when something doesn't feel quite right, and to intervene and minimise risk is a really important part of our setup. So that's why I wanted to show you this diagram and the extent of safeguarding. Okay, what I want to touch on now is I want to go back to that definition that was picked out within working together to safeguard children. And they pick out 4 key elements, which you can see in front of you there. They talk about keeping children safe from maltreatment, providing effective care that keeps children safe, preventing health or development impairments, but also getting the very best outcomes for children. And it's really useful to look at these 4 pieces when thinking about setting up new provision. So if we take that definition and think about the responsibilities that we have, which are significant and wide-ranging, and think about the policies and procedures that we need to plan for, to train staff and then introduce to the children and train them in, it's a big job to do. And it's really helpful, I think, to take on the persona or characteristics of a child and think about walking the school in relation to these 4 elements, to think, have we got it covered? Have we thought about everything? And does this procedure or system work? So if we take, for example, and I'll just give you some examples here of different children who present with different characteristics, if you like. And if we think about each of those 4 elements, let's take that piece first around being safe from maltreatment. If we think about that, we're going to need to set up systems to identify triggers that staff might spot, and that is receptionists through to site manager, through to teachers and support staff in classrooms. They'll need to be able to gather that information and record it somewhere and be able to check that. If we're also going to keep them safe from maltreatment, remember the recruitment and vetting point that we made. We're going to need to make sure that vetting and recruitment procedures are absolutely bulletproof. And that will be from the advert that goes out to the out for post of, I don't know, the cook in the canteen, to the cleaner, to the maths teacher, to the senior leader, making clear in the advert what this job's about, that safeguarding is really important here, it's the priority, and that we actively vet and check and expect the highest standards. So the advert's going to need to knock them dead. The process in terms of how do we bring people into the school, which will be questioning at interview, asking really clearly about declarations, scrutinising application forms to check for gaps, and then follow that through and challenge candidates who present themselves. If they come and have a look at your school, you want the tour around the school to be robust. They need to be vetted in reception and brought in a way that's measured and keeps children safe and really conveys the message that safeguarding is on point here and we do things in the right way. Similarly, things like lockdown procedures and filtering and monitoring through IT to make sure that children are safe from online content and potential threats online will be important. If we take that second point around safe and effective care, we're going to need to make sure that the environment is safe, and that will mean things like the asbestos register. These things used to be the bane of my life when I was in school. Asbestos, Legionella were the nightmares because it was something I just didn't understand. But making sure I got staff who did understand it and giving me some capacity through training to be able to test and check that was a really important part of making sure the environment was safe for children. Another bane of my life, but I didn't ever want to let it go, was timetabling, supervision rota, duty and cover. Getting those things right, absolutely critical. And at the moment, I want to say a little bit about cover and COVID actually. Was in a school yesterday where they were about 30% down on staff, so organising cover was a big headache, and making sure that they could look at safeguarding priorities first in terms of cover. So DSL cover came first, health and safety in terms of delivery of subjects in PE and DT came second on the list, but thinking things like that through a really important part of, is this a safe environment? And then having to make key decisions in that school yesterday about what could run and what couldn't run safely. Really important when thinking about the environment for children. But really simple things like the procedure and the drill for wet play, fire drill and evacuation. So if we've got a child who presents with a sensory impairment or physical impairment, how do we get that child out when we have an evacuation? Who's going to put together the PEEP, the personal evacuation plan for that child? And are we going to review that when we move from temporary accommodation to the new accommodation? All of these things need thinking of to make sure that things can happen smoothly and children are kept safe as part of that. The third element of the definition under working to safeguard children in practice is around health and development impairments. So an interesting one. And it's thinking about the broadest definition of a child's health, which could be everything that they experience in their environment. If they've got complex needs, it could be a sensory need. It could be the menu that's offered in the canteen in terms of their dietary needs. It could be the PE curriculum offer in terms of their mobility. But thinking through all of those elements, really important. And again, taking a customer journey of a child who presents with a health condition, a sensory impairment, a mental health need potentially, really makes us think about, is this right for all the children? Can they access it? And is it safe? COVID has seen huge investments around mental health and emotional well-being. So thinking about the provision made in school for children is really important in terms of mentoring or counselling. Is that something we need to tap into, something that we need to think of? Again, do we know who the partners are? Have we forged those relationships yet? Thinking about mental health first aid. Who are going to be those key people who are trained in mental health first aid to spot the signs for children, but also look after the staff team and make sure that we're spotting signs and responding with appropriate support and intervention when we need to. We mentioned earlier on the child with an allergy. For those children who need to access medications, are those medications readily available? Where are they stored? Who oversees that? Who checks the expiry dates? So thinking about management of medications is really, really important, and parental involvement and consent for that is critical too. And thinking through maybe some of those emergency care plans and emergency access to site. One of the things that I had to walk through on a number of occasions actually with new schools, particularly in temporary sites, was if an ambulance had to get onto this site, how on earth would it happen? Communication, who would make the call, but also how would they access sites and how would they access children? So thinking those emergency plans through, really, really important. In terms of securing the very best outcomes for children, you'd hope if we get those three elements right and we provide those optimum conditions, the very best outcomes should fall out of that. If they're safe, if they're fed, if they're warm, if they're protected and their needs are met, the outcomes should follow. And a lot of that will come through curriculum in terms of attainment and progress, but in terms of getting it right safety-wise, children will be allowed to thrive if all of those conditions are met. I want to talk about this. I know I've alluded to some of it already, and what I don't want to do is kind of say, oh gosh, you know, the odds are stacked against us in new schools. We haven't got a chance of getting this right. But I just want to raise awareness about some of the challenges that new schools do face. It is tougher for new schools. There is absolutely no doubt about that, in so many ways. But you do have the advantage, the huge advantage, of being able to set the tone and create a new culture from the start. It is a golden opportunity that many other schools will bite off your hands to have. And creating that new culture, which makes safeguarding the heartbeat of the organisation, is a real opportunity. It's going to need investment, and it will need investment in setting up procedures and training staff to get ready, quality assuring those procedures and testing the staff's understanding to check they know and understand how to do things around here, and then maintaining them. And that will be about ongoing training to top up knowledge and skills, but also continually refining the environment as we see cohorts of children through. As the cohort grows or as children arrive with different needs, we'll constantly need to maintain and refine. Let's look at each of these then in turn. And that first one is about multitasking. And if you already have a new open school, you'll be well aware of this one. And if you're in the process of opening, you will be well aware. Leaders will be multitasking in new schools. It's something that I became very aware of on the first few free school projects that I was involved with. And that can be dangerous. And it can be dangerous where the head is the DSL and there is only one trained DSL. We've seen that in a number of schools. It's an awful lot of work to carry, and it's an awful lot of things to juggle, as well as leading the school to opening, getting it open and getting it running. The deputy, if you do have a deputy head, is often all things to all people. They might be the education visits coordinator, the medical needs lead and the SENCO. Everybody's carrying a really hefty workload. And my advice to navigate around this is, whilst people are multitasking, because we won't get away from that, is to train all of the staff in strong daily procedures. So how does it run on a day-to-day? And that's going to be thinking through succession planning and making sure that all of your team are well equipped in smooth daily running. So it's going to be arrival routines. How do we get the kids in safely? How do we conduct meet and greet? How is cover organised, and what are the priorities driving cover? If it's wet play, how do we do duty effectively, and where are the key duty points and pinch points in school that we really need to front load in terms of staffing? Making sure that that's really explicit for all of your team, and the way in which you manage it is explicit, will pay dividends in the long run as you begin to grow new leaders from within your staff and plan for succession. Temporary sites, I've alluded to this a number of times, and it does present challenges. It offers a place for you to get going and get the school open, which is great. However, it does present another challenge in so much as you create an environment that's great for the kids, it's safe, we're ready to go, we're ready to open. However, you've then got to duplicate and adjust those plans for the new permanent site, which does come with risk and challenge. So making sure that those adjustments are ready to go as soon as that new site opens. Really simple stuff like signage, entrances. It might completely change the way that you do meet and greets and departure at the end of the day. It might also change arrangements around access to toilets, transport, a whole army of factors that need considering if you're going to go into a temporary site and then have to make that change. And communication with parents around that is critical from the get-go. The transfer of information, this has been, and I need to be careful what I say here, an ongoing challenge for new schools, as the information flow into new schools hasn't been great. The school is the new person on the block, so the information doesn't always get to where it needs to go because of unknown contact. The new school is often seen as the competitor and taking children from other schools, so the share of information from school to school is sometimes slow or doesn't happen. I'd like to think that this has got better over time. I can certainly see evidence of improvements here. However, where it doesn't happen, getting hold of the histories around children and their current context is an absolutely essential component of safeguarding. And making sure that we do get that and strengthening getting hold of that through admission procedures is critical. The transfer and share of information is a statutory responsibility of every agency. That includes schools. So where that is a struggle or a challenge, and I would urge you to be proactive in this, you need to be really clear in communications with other schools that it is a statutory requirement and they have to pass that information to you. And quoting Kixie and working together to underline just how important that is, because without that information, you're starting from nothing with a blank page with children who could potentially have multiple risks around them. So information transfer, do prioritise that. Growth spurts. I'm sure all of you have got secure commissioning for places and your growth is planned, and we'll see your schools full and oversubscribed in no time. Planning for growth spurts is really, really important, and I'm sure you've heard this from other people talking about different challenges that free schools face. Plan for those growth spurts in staff, and training staff is really important. Have staff huddle together around the culture. What we see in free schools is this great blitz mentality to that initial team, getting the school open, getting the kids in and having a great start, which is fantastic. And we see some wonderful schools open with that approach. Bringing in that next batch of staff sometimes is challenging as they've not been part of that first rah, let's go for it, let's get the school open. So bringing them in and making them feel part of that is really important. Some really, really neat tricks around buddying new staff with that existing cohort and that existing team have been really effective in building those relationships and building and adding to that existing culture. Training those staff though and have them walk the routines, rehearse the routines with children is essential. That core group know them really well, know them inside out, but those new staff won't have had that experience and need the opportunity to do that, to rehearse, to practice, to make sure it's just as good as that first group of staff who did it, and get to know and understand your social norms and thinking about bringing staff in. During COVID, a number of schools have done some really great stuff around staff training. So where they have had chance to deliver face-to-face sessions, which was interrupted throughout, they've done some really high quality recording of that so that when new staff join, they can watch that back and see that existing team interacting as part of that training. But also they've used it with cover staff. And they've kind of done an edited shorter version so that when new cover staff are having to come in now to cover COVID absence, they've got those resources ready to go. And it's very much the culture of the school is portrayed through that training that's delivered by the staff team, rather than having to go through a rushed execution in reception with them and have them read a policy. So think about growth spurts and think about staff training along the way with that. I've talked about networks, and free schools, new schools, sometimes if they don't know the community well, struggle with the network connections, and they might start and open the school without a network within the local community or some new network partners that they're working with. What I'd say is get to know everybody, get yourselves on the circulation lists, undertake local training to do with safeguarding wherever you can. And I know sometimes the waiting lists for local training are frustrating. However, that's the place to connect with those people. Often those actively engaged in safeguarding activity, including the LADO and safeguarding officers, are often involved in delivery of that training within local authorities. So it's important to try and engage in that wherever you can. Within local authorities, there'll be networks for DSLs often, being part of that, really important. Signing up to police panels for safer schools, another really important place to be, share information and gather local intelligence to inform your offer in schools and the way you look after children. There'll be EVC networks too, for educational visits coordinators, and attendance officer networks often to share practice around attendance. There's been a real ramp up of activity around attendance since COVID, and so some of those networks actually are far more live now than they previously were. So signing up to those, really, really important. And where possible, make friends with the trusts and local schools and to tap into their expertise. So I've talked about systems and that setup in the previous slide of systems as a new school, and there being lots to do. One thing that I would promote, advise you to invest in is a robust system around safeguarding. And if possible, and I know finance is tight, having worked with schools managing that budget in the open phase, is look at an electronic system that will allow you to capture the data in a robust way. You can train staff from the start. You can transfer information from children, from children's previous schools electronically, and all of that adds to ease of record keeping around children. Paper systems can work well, but they are labour intensive, and that electronic system does help. It helps save time, helps impact on positively on staff workload. So it's definitely worth the investment. So some risks around new schools. Risks are opportunities there, and we have to see them as that for sure. Okay, we've said a little bit about safeguarding culture, and I've talked about some of the challenges that we might face in creating it. But to offer some further detail around the definition, I've talked about it being the heartbeat of the organisation and everyone's responsibility. And as new schools, we have a real opportunity to do that. And safeguarding isn't just about what we do for those children with significant risks around them. It's what we do for all children. Child protection is a small element of that, and it's about what we do for complex kids in the case of child protection. A culture of vigilance requires a number of elements to it. It requires us to use all of our senses, and that's training staff to be hyper vigilant around what have they seen, what have they heard, what have they smelt, what do they feel around children, things they might hear when walking down the corridor, when walking the site, when doing meet and greet in the morning, getting them to be professionally curious and hyper vigilant around all of those things. And as leaders, you'll need to set the parameters for that, and you'll need to train them how to be professionally curious. And revisiting that notion time again is a useful one through briefing. Being professionally curious on the corridor, what does that look like? It does involve hanging around those pinch points. It does involve hanging around where those groups of children are that we might have concerns about, or seeing what happens, how kids use the loos, how kids use the playground. We'll need to model that for staff. We'll need to remind staff and children around safeguarding culture and what does that mean, and we'll relate that back to the school rules. You know, what does safe mean on the corridor? What does safe mean on the playground? And how do we conduct ourselves to keep others safe and ourselves safe? Constant reminders and modelling for them. We'll also need to train staff in how to spot risk, manage and mitigate risk, and we're going to have to talk about it with them. And that might mean a debrief following a wet playtime. It might mean a debrief after a disastrous lunchtime in the canteen when things just didn't go well, and picking out those key bits of practice that weren't effective and the kind of impact that had and how we might fine-tune those next time. It might be talking to staff who've taken a visit out of school and maybe not completed the evaluation of the visit and pointed back to some of those operational factors, you know. How did supervision go? How was the transport? Was the drop-off point the right place to take children? Where did you cross over the road? You know, where was it safe to do the head count of children because you've got 100 of them out of school? All of those things, getting them to think and talk about those things so that they focus on the detail as you do. Okay, safeguarding curriculum. I've talked about training staff, but I just want to emphasise it here again. And safeguarding curriculum, I think, falls in two bits. I think there's a portion that's for staff and there's a portion that's for pupils or for students. Kixie, a number of years ago, stated that we must provide. It talked about could and should prior, but in the last two versions, it's talked about must provide a safeguarding curriculum that upskills the children. So that's a responsibility that we carry, which is significant. And in order to do that effectively, we've got to have and provide a great safeguarding training programme for the staff. We have to equip them and upskill them and make them feel confident so that they can then provide and deliver to children in a really effective way, and that in a way that they feel confident with the content, but also the way in which they'll deliver that. And the curriculum is about empowering, enabling, but also building your own capacities to safeguard. The more people we've got on the job with this, the safer we're going to be, staff and children. If we teach the children what to do, you know how it is. They tell it how it is, and they'll tell us when it's not safe, and they'll tell us when they're not happy with something. So equipping everybody to do this makes it a safer place to be. These two pieces of curriculum for staff and children do need to be aligned and fall side by side. Staff have got to be supported to have the knowledge of what they're going to deliver for kids. RSE is a really classic example here. A lot of work has been done and time invested in training staff to deliver RSE effectively in schools, whether that be in primary or secondary. And we have to do a really good job of making staff feel confident and comfortable with the content before they have to then go and deliver to children. So doing the work with staff first and getting it in the right order is key in terms of them then rolling it out to children. We need to make sure that the training is led by DFE, Ofsted requirements, but informed by safeguarding data in the school. So if we take RSE as an example, we know that the 2020 requirements are clear in terms of what the children have got to know by the end of primary, by the end of secondary. They're written down for us, and that is clear. However, within each of your schools, you've got a unique community that you serve. And so we have to take what's happening within your school and your local community and feed that into curriculum for the children. If within your recording system you see a sudden spike in domestic violence amongst the families that you serve, then we absolutely need to tackle that in the curriculum for staff and for children. We need to talk to staff about how to spot domestic violence. What is domestic violence? Why is it dangerous for children to be in homes where that's happening? And how do we deal with it? How do we respond to it? Once we've done that with the staff, we then need to feed into the curriculum for children. What are respectful relationships? How does that look within a family environment? Where is the line? What's not appropriate? So that we can use that local knowledge and feed it into curriculum to enable and empower both staff and children. So statutory requirements are key, but your local intelligence and your local data is absolutely essential in shaping the curriculum for both. We always need to look for what's coming too. So horizon scanning is really useful in all parts of school improvement, but it is here too. A number of schools might look at, the Kixie appendix and think, gangs, it's not really an issue here. However, being connected to things like the police panel and all of those networks that I spoke about actually might reflect something different in the community. So being close to that agenda, thinking about what's coming, talking to people who might have more intelligence than us, we'll organise our priority of topics that we're going to cover in staff training and also in the curriculum for children. So always looking for what's coming. Thinking about the policy and how we apply and rehearse that. So thinking, okay, we've taught the staff about what to do, what's the content going into curriculum, but also if we've got content on policy and procedures about being safe on the playground, making time within staff training and within delivery to children to rehearse that. So if lunchtime was a disaster the previous day, then we take time to go back over it with staff through training, and we take time from the children in terms of rehearsing and practicing and getting that right. So aligning those two things side by side, absolutely critical. Okay, COVID. Didn't really want to end on COVID, but here we are. What do we know about what's expected? How do we safeguard within the context of COVID? KICSI 2021 hasn't gone away, it's statutory, so we can't not do anything that's in there. We just will need to do things a little bit differently. What schools were required to do right at the onset was put together a policy addendum which outlined how safeguarding procedures will run during COVID, and that forced schools to think differently about delivery methods, particularly during the series of lockdowns that happened, and the way in which they interacted with families, but also with external agencies as well. Right now, this has shifted a little bit, and the engagement methods, everyone's back in school, well, those who are not absent due to COVID, majority back in school, so things are running pretty much close to normal as we could be. However, we do still have children and staff at home, so there are some adjustments that still sit within there. As I've said earlier on, cover and staff and pupil absence is still a significant issue right now, and that does impact on our delivery methods around safeguarding. And I want to flag here in particular the way in which we vet staff coming into the school, supply staff. School I was in yesterday, we were looking at vetting and also the safe access to the school. During my 10 minutes spent in reception, the call came through from the supply agency to say the 2 staff we were sending today for cover have got COVID, they're not coming in. And so we've got 2 other staff. So that was done in a phone call, you know, in a number of seconds. And so the school had to be agile enough to say, right, okay, hang on, we need the profiles for these staff. We need to make sure vetting's done appropriately. And when they landed, they were brand new to the school, so someone had to pick them up, do the tour, do some safeguarding briefing with them and get them ready for school and check the documents. So they did all of that. But these are the challenges that schools are facing right now. Some of these are new now that everyone's back in school, but we've got to be alert to them and be able to plan for them. Okay. So let's think a little bit more about COVID. And as I've said, it's not all bad, right? There are some positives to come from this, which we have to grab with both hands, I feel. What I've looked at here, 3 core components really. During COVID, how do we safeguard within that context? So systems, children and families themselves, but also staff too. The electronic systems that schools have, well, the majority of schools have, and I know I've made my earlier kind of promotion on electronic systems, have provided a lifeline to most schools throughout COVID. They've aided communication, staff have been able to work from home, still securely logging in, but logging that welfare support that they've done to families, and also to allow them to do real-time reporting on what's happening around a family or a child. Serious concerns are still being able to be logged and then follow through accordingly with calls and virtual meetings and other things. Having DSL cover available to manage those systems has been essential. So having DSL duty, that's challenging at the moment where we've got staff absence, so making sure DSL duty is viable is really important. COVID's seen a number of schools train many more people to have DSL capability to enable and support DSL duty during COVID and the challenges that that's thrown up for us. So electronic systems have been great. Great whilst everyone was out, but also great when everyone was back in to make sure that information was captured somewhere. Right now, absence is the biggest challenge, and electronic systems, obviously for attendance, exist in all schools, but schools have started to line that up with their safeguarding system and recognise absence as a safeguarding issue. Absence is significant up and down the country in terms of COVID-related absence, children testing positive and not being able to get in, but also still a challenge around returning some of those children post-COVID lockdown back into school. Absence is limping along in some cases, but seeing that as a safeguarding concern is a really positive way to approach in terms of recording, challenge, conveying expectations, but also engaging other partner agencies to really take absence seriously. So systems making sure that they are robust to continue no matter what happens with COVID have been essential and have been a real positive that's come out of the pandemic. The children and families themselves, throughout COVID, we had vulnerable cohorts defined for us, and many schools extended that to bring many more children onto site during lockdown, which was great, and it served those children well. The focus and the emphasis around this now seems to have shifted. Now that schools are back open again, what's being identified is another cohort who are reluctant to return or anxious about returning, or who have returned in fits and starts. So knowing that shift in cohort has been really important for schools, and making sure that they have the input, be it face-to-face, through home visits, or through virtual visits online, to try and reconnect those children and give them time and space to get them back in. But that shift in cohort has been important for schools to be ahead of that, to plan for it, and to work with other agencies to get those children back in. In terms of staff, retraining them on how to conduct themselves safely in the new environments. Online learning was a real gift in many cases for children to continue to engage academically, but also in a pastoral way with staff during those multiple lockdowns. And it's certainly aiding those children who are having to isolate now where they have COVID. And many schools have actually gone on to use that in other contexts as well, where children are out on exclusions, making sure they've got continued access to learning. So training staff to do that effectively has been really important. We had some headaches along the way. So if we looked at the increased referrals to LADO during that period, where staff have perhaps tripped up in terms of the way in which they delivered, how they were dressed when they were delivered, where they were when they were delivering, just really simple operational things that schools maybe didn't give the time to think through. But thinking through remote learning, how does that happen? What are our expectations? And making those clear in the remote learning policy, a really important part of safer working practices. Training staff to do things differently, to do welfare calls through a virtual meeting, to actually have form tutors do a welfare call on the phone was brand new for some people. And really great schools wrote scripts to make sure that that was done in a professional way. It took account of all the key elements around safeguarding to test and find out if families were safe, and if families were experiencing problems, how would they then deal with that? But teaching staff to be professionally curious in a virtual environment as well is quite challenging. So training staff to think about, what am I looking for when I'm looking into the home environment? What kind of questions am I asking? And all of that work continues for a small cohort of children who are still at home in some cases. So it's really important that we train staff to do that and to do it effectively. Whilst I don't want to end on COVID, I want to end on top tips. So it's not all bad around COVID. Some of the advantages I've already talked about. Electronic communication has been an absolute gift throughout that period. And the remote and independent learning, I think, has offered us a tool that we'll use going forward into the future. Some great resources available to children, and schools have addressed that in a really positive way. The environments and behaviour, thinking about how staff have stepped up, but also how children have stepped up and benefited from some of that virtual and online tutoring. Relationships and trust, this comes out so strong in the schools that I visit. During COVID, schools and leaders of schools became the trusted adults. You were the ones taking out food to families, visiting to see if they were okay, to check in on the children. And those relationships that we gained during that period have certainly served the schools well in moving forward and in continuing to engage with some of the hardest to reach families. Pastoral capacity has certainly been expanded through that period. Form tutors have stepped up and others have got experiences they didn't have before in conducting welfare calls and engaging with families in a completely different way. So there's lots to take away. If I come to sum up the session, these are the top tips that I think are things that we should take away from it. Don't simply focus on compliance. A culture's built. It's not about a tick sheet, it's always about investment and leadership and that continual focus, rehearsal, revisit of safeguarding culture. In terms of the safeguarding culture itself, make it tangible, so relate it back to those 4 responsibilities spelled out in working together, which is it healthy, is it safe, is it best for children? If it is, the outcomes will be great ones, so make it tangible and clear for staff. Always have in your minds that it could happen here. Encourage staff to be professionally curious and to always ask questions. If you think ahead, you're far better prepared to spot risk and minimise it. So always think the worst. I often get accused of that. In terms of the systems, test them regularly and have the systems that you need. Rehearse them. Ask what if the system weren't there or what if it didn't work. If there's a disastrous lunchtime or a poor receiving visitors, review it, revisit the procedure, test it and build it stronger. Have a live agenda around safeguarding, so continually be talking about it. That could be policy testing, ask questions of the staff, ask of specific children, think about the customer journey. If little Johnny with the sensory impairments had to evacuate the building now and he was over in the art block, how would we do that? What might the barriers be? How can we mitigate against that? Ask the questions about the difficult playtime. Ask them if they had to run the whistleblowing policy. Who would the go-to people be? What are the procedures? What do we do? How do we handle that around here? Use the national news and local news to inform that live agenda and that ongoing safeguarding dialogue that you have to make sure it's relevant within your community, but it also taps back into the big picture. Train and support staff to be alert to signs, professional curiosity. You've got to manage it. Get them to focus on what they hear, see, smell and feel. How many times have we all said, I have in my own personal life, I had absolutely no idea that that person was in that place. I really can't believe that happened. Teach people to be professionally curious about children and also about their colleagues. Then we've got to skill up the children. Let's tool them up. So give them a voice and upskill them to be strong and take a stance. And we can do that through curriculum and training for them and student leadership. Let's give some leadership to them around how we lead safeguarding in schools. That's it from me. Over to you for questions if we have any.
Lovely, thank you so much, Jane. Just while we answer questions, we're just going to pop up a quick feedback poll. So if you do have to head off, if you could just give us your impressions quickly there. And we just had one question in from Stuart. Stuart, do you want to just unmute yourself actually and just talk through your question if that's okay?
Yeah, thanks very much. Excellent presentation, Jane. Well done, fantastic. You're welcome. I'm a non-exec of a school, a SAT. I'm on the safeguarding committee, and really I'm very conscious of sometimes, nose in, hands off, right? So yeah. As a member of the board, yeah. So I'm always very conscious of overstepping the mark around questioning. So it would be good to know from your perspective, really, what are the 3 or 4 or however many questions there are that say, look, this probably wouldn't rock the boat too much by asking these kind of things. I mean, they're used to me asking questions anyway, because I'm inquisitive. So that's important. Okay.
The first thing I'd say is establish really robust reporting procedures into any kind of governance structure. And I know I've done the big promotion. I'm not on commission for any kind of electronic version of record keeping. However, they offer up really good reporting mechanisms. And those reporting mechanisms don't open up confidences around children. What they do is give governance bodies, really clear pictures of the context of safeguarding within a school. So you'd have a notion of the number of concerns that staff are raising. You'd also have a notion of the type of concerns that staff are raising. So I gave an example of a spike in domestic violence. So it would give all of those categories: domestic violence, peer-on-peer abuse, all of that. Once governors have, at any level, a notion of a clear picture of safeguarding, the questions fall out of it. So once you have that in front of you, you are able to ask some key questions, which are questions around the peaks and troughs in the data. Why is that high? Why is that not so? In terms of reporting in staff, are all of the staff reporting? If not so, why so? If we have a peak in the data, what training has been done for staff? What training has been done for children to address it? And once that's happened, when you come back and do another cycle of that, you can then review the impact of it. So I think it's fair to say when governance have all of the data, the questions become very obvious. Does that help, Stuart?
Yeah, I think the challenge is obviously central data is a little bit out of date. So, you know, as a NED that likes to ask questions around statistics and performance, because obviously I see the SEN register and it's my responsibility to question, you know, what's on it and what's being said. In fairness to the school, sometimes because it's not reported geographically, and I happen to be a non-exec of a school in Bolton, which obviously has gone through some massive trauma, particularly over COVID. You know, they were affected, they were on the news every day. So when you start to look at statistics, they look high. And the danger with any statistics is you've got to drill down anyway. So they don't report regionally, and that's a little bit of the challenge. Is that a fair comment to say? Because it tends to be national statistics, which is probably not fair when you're looking supporting a school in the Northwest that has been challenged.
Are you talking, Stuart, about the collation of data within the trust?
Yeah, well, I'm looking at attendance statistics. I'm looking at who's on the SEN register, how many people are on the SEN register, what are the areas, you know, whether it's free school meals and all that kind of stuff. And the challenge I find, and I could be wrong because I may well be reading the stats, they may present them in a different way. You know, to compare somebody that needs a school meal, who, by the way, is relevant, to comparison to somebody that's being bullied or something else is sometimes a little bit, you know, there's no defining on, you know, the classifications around, you know, this seriousness is a bit of a loose word around, you know.
Oh, Stuart, you've gone on mute, sorry.
Is that reasonable?
I think it is. In order to get underneath and test whether safeguarding is effective, I think you need the data which is around the reporting of safeguarding concerns and the nature of concerns. Until you have that, I don't think governors can ask questions that either challenge or support leaders within a school to talk about, are your systems effective? Is the training effective for staff and children, and what impact is that having? I think you need that data. And this is a message that I continually convey to schools. Without the data, your governance will never be strong because they cannot challenge you in effective ways. Okay,
thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Lovely, thank you. We do just have another question from Cam. Cam, if it's all right with you, are you happy for me to pick this up with you separately outside the session, just aware of timings on our side, and perhaps we can do something a bit more sort of comprehensive on the everyone's invited agenda, because I think that's a really interesting question. Lovely. All right, thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I really hope that was useful and interesting for you. And yes, if you do have any other questions for Jayne that kind of come to mind afterwards, do just contact us at events@newschoolsnetwork.org, and we're happy to pass those on as well. Huge thank you to Jayne as well for, as ever, a wonderful presentation. Thank you all, and I hope to see you next week on Thursday for our final session, which is around working towards your first Ofsted. So please do register for that if you've not done so already.